Yeah, thanks for coming out to see this, everybody. I had a sneaking suspicion it would be a popular one, given the panellists. And let me do a bit of an extended introduction so we know who we're talking with. Richard Miron, you're the director of For the Birds. It's your debut film. Richard's a graduate of Yale University, and you made a short-form version of For the Birds called Lucky Ducks as your graduate film, yeah? Tell us a little bit about what the film is.
For the Birds is about a woman in rural New York who has about 200 pet ducks, chickens, geese, and turkeys, and she's very much in love with them. And she lives with her husband as well, and her husband is growing tired of the birds around the house. And an animal rescue group comes in to try to negotiate to take some of these birds off of Kathy's hands, and that's where I started filming, and it's been 6 years in the making, and the story just kept escalating in all kinds of surprising ways, so that's why it took so long.
A labour of love, I think, I've been discovering from you. We'll have a look at a clip in a moment to get a taste of the film, but we're also joined by Brian Reed. Brian, you're an exec producer on For the Birds. You will also know Brian, no doubt, as the presenter and co-creator of S-Town, and you're senior producer on This American Life as well. How did you get involved in the project, and what was your role on it? I know you're the exec, but what did you do?
I'm friends with Richard, and I went to a screening. I've heard him talk about the movie over the years, tell me about this lady who had a bunch of ducks and chickens and whatnot. And anyway, I went to a screening back in last August, when the movie was 37 minutes longer, I think. It was that cut of the movie.
Yeah.
And I was just enamored of it. It was exciting to finally see it. And I just, I was moved and impressed with the time put in and the patience of the filming and the arc that Richard and Jeff, as fellow producer, had eked out of all this raw material. And anyway, so I was just like, I had some thoughts that I was sharing. We were like getting drinks afterwards and kept talking about it and just gave some feedback. And yeah.
Brian had a lot of wonderful perspective for us at the time because we were very much in the weeds with the film, and we all respected Brian's work as a storyteller, and he gave a breath of fresh energy into the film.
Because it was one of those situations where like you go to a screening, or the radio version is an edit where we read the story aloud to each other in a room, and you'll have worked on something for a long time, and then the feedback you're getting, everyone's telling you their like thoughts and the notes that they have and things they want you to change and things that aren't working, and it kind of piles up, and it makes you feel like you don't have anything, like this is totally not working at all. And I kind of sensed that at the end of the screening with these guys, and I really related to it because I've been in that position. But also I think a lot of times actually those notes that feel very fundamental are actually pretty easy to fix at the stage in the process that these guys were in. And so I remember just saying, you guys have a really good movie, and like you're like 85% of the way there. I know it feels like this screening is just a bunch of people being like, this is wrong and this is too long and you don't know what the movie's about and blah, 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 blah. And sometimes it's just helpful to be like, actually, like, it sounds big, but there's easy ways to fix those things. Not easy, but it's not fundamental in the way that it feels.
A voice of reason. Here,
so. Yeah.
The fresh eyes are so important on a film, and what a pair of fresh eyes. I mean, because Brian presented S-Town, and we're going to try the impossible today, because we're going to try and talk about both amazing programmes in equal weighting, because there's direct connection between the two. So we will talk about For the Birds and also S-Town as equally as we can. But I think we should start with a clip to give us a sense of For the Birds. And before we do that, who's seen For the Birds at the premiere yesterday? So about half. And then who's heard S-Town? Yeah. Good. And the others were on Mars at the time. But okay. That's great. But let's concentrate on For the Birds first of all. We're going to start with a clip called Pogo, and this is Kathy in the early stages of the film. So all looks well there. Nice lady, keeps wildfowl. Tell us about Kathy and how the film unfolds from there, and also how you came to be in Kathy's world filming her.
Yeah, so I originally met Kathy through the animal sanctuary that had heard about her. So I was up there volunteering. I was looking for a student project for my senior thesis at the Woodstock Farm Animal Sanctuary and wanted to follow a rescue story. And they had heard about this woman who had all these birds nearby, and they were going to go check it out. And I went on the very first visit with them. And so the next scene after this is when the animal sanctuary gets involved, but this is at the very beginning of the movie. And so, yeah, I was just really fascinated by Kathy and how warm and welcoming and proud she was of her birds. And the way the sanctuary was looking at her was they saw a big problem that they wanted to try to solve. And so that scene was sort of the second time that I visited Kathy. And I went up with Jeffree Star, who was a classmate of mine at the time, and we just hung out with Kathy and Gary all day, and that scene was like one of the first moments of like, oh my gosh, this is a real connection she has with these animals, and this might be a high stakes story. So, yeah.
I think it's important to say Kathy had the absolute best intent for these animals, but she couldn't cope, and they were living in their own filth, and she had the tendency to let them live in the house, and her husband, who we find out is quite long-suffering in this environment, was getting more and more frustrated, and then the wider world, the animal sanctuary, the SPCA, yeah, the protection organisation for animals, kind of all started to round on Kathy. And how did you kind of maintain those relations with her when you'd come in through the sanctuary?
I think, yeah, coming in through the sanctuary, I just, I said I was making a student project about animals and people's relationship with animals, and she was very open. And I think the second time we went up there was really when we, developed that relationship, just being, genuinely curious about her relationships with these birds. So, yeah, just we sat down, did an interview with her and Gary, walked around with Gary. Yeah, I think it was important for me to kind of get off on the right foot with her and let her know that I wasn't part of the sanctuary. I was doing this on my own,
I think you did a very clever thing, because the film starts with a home video of the very first duckling that she came to be in ownership of. It just wandered in to her property. You didn't start by going in with the sanctuary, and I think that created the ability to not be judgmental as a filmmaker. That was obviously deliberate, was it?
Yeah, in the editing process, we realized that the film had to start with Kathy. Kathy really became the protagonist, and she's the one we stay with the whole story. And the sanctuary comes in for a good bit and then leaves the story at a certain point. So yeah, we really wanted to kind of get the audience off on the right foot.
Yeah. From the short clip we've seen, I think we could see that Kathy is her own personality, and she grabs immediately. I found her really magnetic. Similarly, for S-Town, you had John B. McLemore. Tell us a little bit then what you saw in similarities or connections between two very magnetic, compelling lead characters.
I think, Kathy and John are both people who are unabashedly themselves, and I like people like that. I admire that. I strive towards that, and often feel myself failing. And I don't know, that's how I would distill the connection. You even saw Kathy just say, I do not care about being different. Who cares? I don't. And I respect that a lot, And obviously that can often lead to, that can be to their own detriment sometimes. But that's what's so remarkable and admirable about it, I think.
And is it fair to say that in their own way, they were a little bit in conflict with the wider world around them?
Yeah, they define themselves against the wider world around them in a way. John, so much of his identity was about railing against his town, the place he'd never left his entire life. He defined himself in opposition to it, and yeah, For the Birds is very similar in that way. You know, there's this community that just doesn't know exactly how to deal with Kathy, and that causes more and more alienation, basically.
Yeah, and I should also say that when I first heard S-Town, I immediately felt parallels. And that's,
you were already filming, obviously.
Oh, yeah, I'd been filming for a really long time, and I'd been hearing from Brian little bits and pieces about what he was making, too. And then when I first heard S-Town, I was like, this is a very similar kind of story, because it's in rural America, and it's somebody who's a bit of an outcast from their community, but they're really magnetic personalities and have a lot of amazing thoughts. So.
Should we hear a little bit of John B. McEnroe? We've got a clip.
Yeah, sure.
Called Pantless Lady, which gives an indication of his character right
That's my
there.
secret name for myself of the clip, but that's fine. This is from a phone call I had with John before I've ever visited him, actually, from the show. That's John.
Yeah, you didn't get it, Brian.
No, I didn't.
And that's your fault.
Yes, yeah.
What was going on there, and what was the wider context of what
he was trying to explain to me? That was meant to be a parable of to get across why Woodstock, Alabama, where John was born and raised and lived his entire life in the house he was born in with his mother, was such a shit town. And that was a lot of our discussions. You know, we'd be talking about very specific things that were going on in Woodstock or things that had happened in John's past, but it all added up to, you need to understand why this place is such a shit town. Like, that was what John was just desperately trying to get me to understand. You know, the first email he wrote to our radio show, the subject line was, John B. McLemore lives in Shittown, Alabama. And that really is like the topic sentence for the entirety of our relationship. And that was, if you just, like, I sometimes think of John as a whistleblower, because he kind of acted that way, where he was sending me emails and calling, in the way that when I've dealt with other whistleblowers, in more traditional contexts, like at the Federal Reserve Bank, for instance, it kind of felt the same, where they are very certain that they know something that the world needs to know. And it can sometimes come off as a bit crazy, and they often get shunned by the people around them. I think that's very common with whistleblowers. And that was how John felt, only he was like whistleblowing on his tiny town in Alabama, and not just in a specific like corruption in the government way, but in the very fiber of this place is a shit town way, and I'm trying to blow the whistle on it. And that was like really, that's the context in which that happened. That was one attempt that he made at trying to get me to understand it, and it really did take a long time for me to understand it, as you can tell from that clip. That was pretty early on in our speaking.
Yeah, I mean, they're both magnetic characters. The second you hear John, the minute you see Kathy, I couldn't stop watching, I couldn't stop listening. What were your thoughts when you first encountered, and what was it, that kind of, I suppose, gut instinct that made you think, yes, absolutely?
I think with Kathy, and probably similarly with John, it sometimes feels like they're thinking faster than they can talk, and they're talking really fast too. And so you're trying to keep up, and you're just like, I want to catch up to what you're thinking about. And so there's just a level of intrigue there where you lean in and you just want to keep listening and trying to understand.
And how about
I think
with
that's
John?
absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, I cut a lot of tape, and I listen to a lot of people talk over and over again. And I've never heard anybody who you could tell how someone's thinking. Like, when you do that, you're like inside of someone's way of thinking and expressing themselves. And I've never encountered anyone like John. I remember when I played I made a shortcut of the very first phone call I had with him shortly after it happened in 2014, and I played it for my editor and the person who made S-Town with me, Julie Snyder, who also created Serial. And I said I had this conversation with this guy John. She was familiar that I was like in touch with this guy. I played it for her, and one of her first notes was like, you might have to say that like you're not speeding him up, basically, in the writing when you eventually write this, just because he's so virtuosic in his way of speaking.
I think they were both very nervous about the world around them. from what I've seen, and therefore trust. You as a program maker on S-Town, you as a director on For the Birds, was clearly key. Is that something you had to work at, or did they connect with you and you maintained that throughout? I know in S-Town you didn't, because it was on air, the wobbles.
In my case, I guess John was reaching out to people out, and not just me, outside of his town, and that really helped. He had a whole kind of community and world of people. Myself, he was a antiquarian horologist, which is a person who restores antique clocks. He had a whole network of people who he knew through that world that he was in touch with, including over here, actually. He had, and then he also had like writers and thinkers that he appreciated, and he would reach out to them cold and send them emails about what a shit town Woodstock was, and I was kind of among that group of people, and I think that helped. Like he was searching for people who were not from there to come in and validate his perspective, and so the fact that I was willing to do that, I think, and was interested in what he had to say and took it seriously, I think helped.
It struck me you had to be on your intellectual mettle with him, and that was almost a way that you had his trust.
It was impossible. No, I mean, I zoned out all the time. Like, I could... No, I mean, he would talk about climate change, like, for 30 minutes, and I'm just not a scientific thinker at all, and he would do these presentations for me, where he'd pull me into he had a computer on top of a speaker system in his bedroom that was, like, at eye level, and... because he couldn't sit. So he would just be there standing all night, like on the computer. And a couple mornings when I was visiting, he was like, before we start like the tour today or the investigation today, I have a presentation I need to show you. And I arrived, and on his computer there'd just be 55 tabs open in some browser, organized impeccably, like with an argument he was making about climate change, with like even moments of like little videos for comic relief, like very, very, very dirty videos for comic relief, like just running through these things just in a monologue, but like juxtaposing, graphs of energy consumption with, it was just, it was remarkable and impossible to follow, but also clearly like internally coherent. It was amazing and very, and it was beyond my intellectual mettle, absolutely.
Yeah. You just had to nod on occasions, yeah. With Kathy, lots of people were losing her trust, the animal sanctuary. Was there ever a point where you were, or were you always her confidant in a way, because she could tell her thoughts to you?
Yeah, I don't really remember a time where she lost trust for me. I mean, there were points where she was angry, and I would show up, and she and Gary would be angry with each other, and it wouldn't be a good time for me to be there. But I think in general, it's just the same with Brian. I think if you're just there to listen, and you're genuinely curious and interested, I think people want to be listened to. So. I was there for her in that regard.
I think we should see another clip of Kathy, because it also introduces another key character, which is the attorney at law, who comes in to help her when things go wrong and it goes to court. He becomes her pro bono lawyer. So for the purpose of the name of the clip, it's Brenner Arrival. If we could have a look at that, that'd be great.
I'll just say,
oh, sorry.
This is sort of after the first act of the film, where the sanctuary ends up taking all the birds. They seize all the birds from Kathy and charge her with 95 counts of animal cruelty. So this is in the middle of the movie.
So we see Kathy and Bill Brenner there, the lawyer. How important are those extra characters in a film like this?
When William Brenner came in to this story, I mean, I had no idea. Like this, I didn't even. I mean, I came to court to see Kathy in her first hearing, and this guy showed up, and it was, it's a documentary dream, I think, to have somebody come in with this kind of personality. And this was really the point where I was like, oh, this could be a feature-length film, because this was sort of a major turn of fortune for Kathy to have somebody on her side with so much energy and with some legitimate legal knowledge to try to help her get her birds back.
Was he a genuine help to Kathy? Because for those that have seen the film, well, there could be your next stop could be Better Call Bill, right? It could be the follow-up to that. I mean, was he a welcome addition to her issue?
In not maybe in the obvious ways. He extended this court case for about 9 months, and it caused a lot of trouble for Kathy's marriage, and also for the sanctuary and for the birds themselves. But in a way, he was Kathy's really only supporter that she had, and so in the grand scheme of the story, as we were editing, we realized that Mr. Brenner's role is to validate Kathy and help her connect with humans again, because that's sort of the grand arc of the movie. So, yeah.
While they're all fantastic big characters born for a documentary like this, and also for S-Town, there are lots of ancillary characters, and John B himself. As the people making the documentary, making the podcast, how much do they have a bearing on you, those personalities? Because they're draining to listen to at times. Are they draining to work with?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you're often having to present them in a way that gets at the nut of what you like about them, because none of us are as palatable as we can be when they're like edited, with like tons of hours of thought put into it. So I think that's like kind of what you have in mind, is like you're trying to focus on, you're creating like a feeling of the person, and not just like throwing this like kind of the full force of their like unedited personality out. I mean, it's like a crafted thing that you're making. It's a crafted version of them, But yeah. I mean, having relationships with subjects and sources it can be exhilarating and also really tiring, for sure. And just having to manage those relationships and be fair, but also retain your independence and to be upfront. But and like it's a real negotiation, and especially over a long period of time. There's a lot of challenges in it, for sure. Especially in with a court situation where you're dealing with both sides. I had that experience in S-Town too. And, especially in these small town courts, like you'll be in just like some little like, community center room, basically. And both sides in a very acrimonious battle are just there. And I found, at least in my situation, like they're, each side is coming up and kind of talking to me. And I want to make sure like they both know like I'm not on either side. But, and it's like, yeah, I told you I was talking to the other side, right? But you're all like in this tiny room, and it's just like someone's basement or something. It's a lot to manage, making sure you're just like, just being upfront and being available and getting what you need, while also making everyone feel comfortable. It's an interesting challenge and also tiring. Yeah.
And in terms of how you interact with Kathy and how much it wore you down sometimes, how do you decompress from that? Just by coming away from the situation, or because you both embedded hugely?
Yeah. Where I was filming was about 2.5 hours outside of New York City, where I was living, so I was driving up and back. So yeah, you can take breaks when you get a little worn out. It's pretty intense situations that I would throw myself into, and then kind of need to get in the car and breathe a little bit. But yeah, I also to answer your question from before, Mr. Brenner was like he's very performative. He really loved the camera. As soon as he saw me, he was, and so I had to kind of like really not indulge him as much as I could, because I didn't want it to become the Brenner show, and so I had to kind of not laugh at all his jokes and not really just try to maintain professionalism around him. And in the edit, we really had to kind of trim him down to make sure it wasn't too much.
So working with characters so closely, with John B., with Kathy, what did you learn from them about life, about what you were doing in the process, about how to interact?
I think for me, a big thing that drew me to this situation and to all the people I was following was just thinking about what makes people happy, and outside of the city and the life that I'd sort of grown up, with these sort of filmmaking ambitions and stuff, and there's a quiet happiness and like a local happiness that you can have with family and with a home and with animals, and so I was really drawn to that and was always trying to understand what is it that they want and how can I connect to that.
And Brian, apart from horology and quantum physics and all kind of existential science, what about you?
Well, first of all, I never met Kathy, but what I learned, a big lesson I take from her in the movie is, I won't ruin what happens, but there's a big change that she goes through. She really dramatically changes her life, and every time I see it, I find it really, really inspiring. That's like one of the main things I take from her is the capacity that we have to change so dramatically. It's really reassuring to think that that's like within us. Anyway, that's a big thing I learned from her. From John, I don't know, I learned a lot from all the people in S-Town, but one thing, that I always keep with me from him is just he never got numb to all the terrible shit that's happening in the world, or he never just it always enraged him. Every day he was as enraged as the previous day about all the terrible stuff that we're doing to each other and to the planet, and that's hard for me, and I'm not sure it's necessarily healthy, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we should constantly be giving each other a kick in the ass about that stuff, and so that I really that's something that really stayed with me from getting to know John.
Yeah. I think we should hear from him again in a clip.
Sure.
It can be your choice. These are your secret file names again, but they're likely what he says in the clip. So we've either got Clusterfuck of Sorrow, or Life is a Nut House.
Let's do the clusterfuck. Yeah, that sounds good.
John's words, not ours.
Yeah, number 2. So just to set this up, this is one of my favorite moments from the story. This is from chapter 2 of S-Town, and it's basically, if you haven't heard the story, John contacted us. He wanted to tell us what a shit town Woodstock, Alabama was, but specifically one of the things he mentioned was an alleged murder that had happened in his town that a kid had gotten away with, allegedly, and he wanted us to look into it, and everyone knew about it, he said. So I spent a lot of time looking into this, and I eventually determined that a murder didn't happen. It was actually just a fight in the woods, but everyone believed that a murder had happened, so he wasn't wrong to think that. Anyway, this is the moment where I call him to kind of tell him what I've discovered that this murder, after investigating for more than a year, didn't actually happen. And this is me I've just told him that and run through all my findings.
Damned with faint praise, I think, Brian.
Yeah, exactly.
You cracked the case, and he still wasn't happy.
Yeah. I like that clip for a lot of reasons, but that to me is like what that moment is really what we were trying to do, at least craft-wise. One of the things we were trying to do craft-wise with S-Town, because if you think about that clip, there are kind of I think of two types of interview clips in radio. There's a type where it's someone just telling a story. So the Pantsless Lady clip, the first one I played, where he's telling the story of the lady that they saw on the side of the road who wasn't wearing pants. It's an amazing story. But the nature of that story is him telling something that happened to him in the past. And that's a lot of what great radio and audio stories are built out of, is someone who's a good storyteller recounting something funny or recounting something meaningful or recounting something that was a turning point in a situation that made them change their mind or that they regret. So it's built out of people telling a story in the past and then reflecting on it. But this type of tape is not that. This Clusterfuck of Sorrow piece of tape, it's us interacting. It's fully us going through something where I've put in a bunch of work at his behest, and now I'm telling him about it, and he doesn't care, and he's being curmudgeonly, and I'm being annoyed. And to me, that's that's a type of tape that I'm more interested in these days. And the majority of the tape in S-Town is that type of tape. And that's how you develop character in an audio story, I think. I was thinking, just watching this clip with Brenner and Kathy, it's them interacting, and you get to see Kathy's nervousness, and and Brenner's trying to rile her up, and Brenner's trying to understand Kathy, and he's trying to make a joke and diffuse. Like, you're seeing them interact. So you're the same thing's happening in that clip with the two subjects. But often, I think, then you could do that on radio too. If you're, I could have gotten that scene on the radio for sure. But also, you can do it. I see it less in documentary film, I think, where it's the interviewer who is the one pushing. Often that's the most interesting tape you're using in a radio story, is interactions between the reporter and the subject as their relationship develops, where you're pushing back on someone, or you're calling them out on some bullshit, or you're laughing at their joke, or you're offering a word of comfort if they're reliving something very traumatic. Those are often the most interesting pieces of tape that you're going to, and that's where character reveals itself.
And that's the power of audio storytelling in many ways, that difference of being able to push the story that way.
Yeah, I think I don't know, I'm not that as well versed in documentary film. I'm sure films do it, and I think you could, but I don't know. Yeah, maybe the filmmaker would have to be in front of the camera more. I'm not really sure. There's plenty of interaction from behind the camera.
There's
stuff.
Yeah, you can provoke your subject, and I definitely maintain more of a observational mode of filmmaking with everybody. But there is conflict on screen between people, and that is often the most interesting stuff. So.
We're the way at This American Life and with S-Town, we're when we craft an interview. Like when we think about an interview and plan for it, we're very aware of we're going to have to be in the tape. That's what's going to make the tape work. If someone says something weird, you're going to need to be the audience's proxy calling them out on it. You're going to need to express surprise. You're going to need to... so we're really, really cognizant of that. Like we're trying to be in the tape. Like that's what makes it good. So, and it was interesting, like when you guys did that follow-up with Kathy and we were talking about the interview, it was definitely a different style. Like where I was we were kind of going over questions, and it's just more aggressive in terms of being in the interview than the style of I think documentary film and the way you were making the movie.
As much as incredible characters, I want to talk about the kind of worlds that were built in both projects, because in For the Birds, I really felt that visceral, is it fair to say, backwater town world that Kathy inhabits? And the same in S-Town. I could see the S-Town world in just the kind of audio soundscape and the atmos and the establishes and things. How much of a conscious production process was that to actually capture the world and build that almost as a character?
With For the Birds, in the edit process, we were really starting very small and expanding outward bit by bit.
As the world encroached on Kathy?
Yeah, and the film literally starts with the first shot of the first duckling that wandered onto their yard, and then sort of expands into more and more ducklings and more, and then it's 10 years later, and so things start to complicate each other. And then you bring in the outside world, and then with the sanctuary arriving at Kathy's place, and then eventually you introduce the sanctuary, and you kind of keep expanding outward from this one duckling and this intimate moment with this couple into the town and into eventually the national news coverage that came about with this case, and yeah, so.
So the world widened out. It was insular and it was comfortable and cozy to begin with, and yeah.
Yeah, and it adds more variety to the film too. It kind of keeps you watching because there's more and more to discover.
Can we see a little bit of Kathy's wider world? This is a clip that you might like to intro, which is Brenner's office. We finally get to see his world.
Yeah, you just met Brenner, and after he came into the story, I was curious about him, so I kind of went back to his office to see what was up.
I'm telling you, better call Bill. Get the funding. Get it made.
He pitched it to us.
I bet he did, yeah.
He's on it.
Yeah. I don't know if it's because I'm British, and so all these American worlds are really evocative to me, and they sort of feel associated with the movies I've grown up watching. But do they feel as evocative and something you want to portray to yourselves when you're making them?
Yeah, I mean, I live in a city, and so I'm interested in country life, and so there's kind of a joy to spending time with someone like Mr. Brenner. So. Yeah, and you can. I think a big thing about this clip for me too is you can see how Brenner interacts with his own staff and what his sort of daily life is like. And there's tension and conflict even within this scene and his own work. Because he's more interested in the camera than his client on the phone. So I think you can learn about who he is through that. And I think there's also just a spark of joy in him that was important to get across in the film, that he wasn't a bad guy. He was helping Kathy, and he's interested in helping people and enjoys what he does. So
I think we're going to take questions in a few minutes, so have them ready. But it'd be remiss of us not to talk about the huge task of crafting both of these stories, because you both had reams and reams and reams of material, I presume. How did you both individually set about telling these stories, and was it pre-planned, or was it something that came and was crafted in the edit of both?
I mean, it's both. It's a process. I mean, I find that, I mean, with S-Town, like, you're crafting as you make every decision. So you're deciding to, in the reporting process, before you've cut any tape, before you've written a word, you're still in the middle of reporting. You're still making editorial decisions about who to talk to, what to talk to them about, what threads to follow. And I find that I'm constantly like trying to come up with a structure, a working structure, as I'm working on a story. S-Town was a little different. Like if I'm doing a story for This American Life, we usually try to have a little bit of a better idea, just because we're a weekly show, and we still work on stories for months, but we do try to articulate the structure to each other, at least a working structure that then evolves over time as you do the reporting. S-Town was so open-ended and so weird that was a little harder. Right. But you still are thinking about, what could this structure be? What could the story be? And at the end of the night, I'll write kind of structural ideas and jot things down at the end of a reporting day. And then as you move through the process, eventually we got to a point where Julie Snyder, my editor, and I sat down and basically did a writer's room for 5 weeks, where we just sat in a room with a whiteboard and said, okay, story starts, you get an email from John, write it on the board. You email back and forth for a bit. You get on the phone with him finally. First phone call, that was the only tape I'd cut at the beginning. Everything else, we hadn't touched the tape. We'd logged it and kind of gone through it because it was over the course of years. But and then we just kind of did it that way on the board. We'd get to what felt like the end of a chapter. We'd take a picture of it. We'd erase it. We'd start the next chapter. We'd do that again and again. At the end of that, we couldn't keep it all in our heads. So then we started again with note cards. We made a whole color-coded key. We had an A plot and a B plot, and we had pink was for ideas, and anyway, yeah, so we did that on the board. That was 9 chapters at the end of that process. It's 7 chapters in the end. Then we brought in Starlee Kine, who's a really excellent podcaster in the States. We talked her through the structure on the wall, and she helped us just make, we're making decisions like, that's boring, that's confusing, this is extraneous, this will be punchier if you move it here, you need to put an idea here, sharpen this. And so at the end of that process, we had whittled it down and changed it enough to 7 chapters. And that was like a 5-week process without cutting any tape. And that was the structure I then wrote from. And it was remarkably sound. Like, there were some changes, obviously, and it became more specific. But largely, that's the structure that the story is. So it was an interesting process to do that. I've never done a multi-part series before, so.
A painful process.
Oh my God,
messes your head up, right?
It's the best part of the process. No, that's like the best part. Okay. Or one of them. I don't know. I love that. I love structuring. That's a big part of my job at This American Life. I help people structure their stories. So they come in, they're like, oh, this is what I'm doing, and I've got this, and I've got this, and we talk it through it. It's like jamming. I don't know. I don't play an instrument, but it's kind of like jamming. Like you're kind of just like, well, what if it went this way? All right, well, what if it went that way? No. And you can, and with radio at least, I don't know, like we talk it to each other because you kind of have to feel the energy as you're telling the story to each other. And you can feel when it lags, and you kind of note which parts you try to speed over because it's expositional, and you note which parts you're trying to really land on because it's interesting. And we just like type everything everybody's saying, and then look at it, and we'll make and just over and over and over again. I love it. It doesn't mess with my head.
Good.
It's like where I feel most.
Well, that's why you're doing what you do.
Yeah.
Richard, you've already referred to it as a 3-act structure. Was that the way you approached the whole project always, or did it become that? And how did you craft that in edit?
Yeah, I mean, the story kept progressing while we were editing. We were editing for about 2.5 years on this movie, and things kept happening. And so, I think a 3-act classical structure is the mode I was thinking in, and was working with Jeffrey Starr, who's editing with me.
Who's at the back?
He's in the back. Yeah.
Gives a wave.
Yeah. Yeah, so we were thinking about the weight of the turns of the story, and we're most very interested in surprise and how you can set an expectation and then flip it, because that was always happening in this story. Every time we thought something would happen, the exact opposite would happen. So it was really important to bring the audience on that journey. But in terms of structure, we at first we thought our Act 1 climax was a certain point where all the birds were taken away from Kathy, and then it was going to be a court battle for the rest of the movie. But then after the court battle went to trial, there was a whole other act that happened, which was about Kathy and Gary's relationship, and the intimacy of going through a divorce and getting sick and caring for each other, that started to really become the most compelling stuff of the movie. And also, I think it's a bit different from radio too, because we didn't have any narration. We didn't really have we had to let the footage speak for itself only, or at least we set those parameters for ourselves. So it was really about watching and listening to the footage and feeling it, and what was the most moving, what were the most surprising moments in the footage, and how can we sort of
And do you love that process as well, or do you love it in retrospect? Because that's how I do it. I go through pain at the time, and then in retrospect I love it.
It's a mixture of pain and joy, because there's a lot of time where you think you're never getting anywhere, and then suddenly you'll have a breakthrough and something will click and you say, this is right. So I think it's definitely a lot of ups and downs.
And then you second guess it a couple weeks later.
Yeah.
And then you go back to it.
And recut it. Thank you very much. We're not over. We're gonna have some questions now, but I think we can do several applauses. So initially, I'd like to thank you both for that. It was really insightful. And do we have anybody with any questions at the front here?
Hi, my question is for Brian. So when we listen to like really top-notch audio storytelling like Serial or S-Town, it feels as the listener as if you've had oceans of time and like an unlimited budget to spend time with people and edit down and no restraints. But I also work in public radio in the States, and we're always facing worse and worse budget problems. So would you like to pop that myth for me? Do you have as much,
We are very lucky. Yeah, we do. It's like podcasting is going through like a really special moment right now, and we have the budgets and freedom to spend time on things, and that is the only way that we have the budgets. And honestly, the real secret is we have the budgets and freedom to spend time and to kill stories all the time. So we have the budgets to go out in stories, to send reporters on stories, to spend time editing stories, months in some cases, with multiple trips all around the country, and then to decide it's not good enough and to kill it. And that is happening every day. That's a big part of my job as senior producer. I'm hearing tape. So in this editing process where I'm trying to structure with people, we'll structure, we'll try, and then we'll kill, and we'll move on. And that's the biggest luxury we have, and it's the only way we're able to keep the quality high. There's no other secret sauce. There's no other, editing, like obviously like those are all important elements, but without, that's such an integral part. It's not bad to have a story killed. It's not a shame. It's both provided for in the budget and culturally a triumph in our office to kill something that's not great. So that's really lucky to have that at our shop, and it's just been built in from the very beginning. Even at a time when we weren't as flush. Ira, when he started This American Life in the 90s, he had a very small budget, a tight staff. He still built in, I think, something like a budget to kill a third of the stories that they started. He had the vision to know that. And that's always just been a culture of the place, that anything could be killed at any point. We have the freedom to do that. And that's good. Like, let's move on. It's so much harder to drag a mediocre story over the finish line to make it something that you can even stand to listen to and feel a little proud of. That's so much harder than just to make something excellent. It's just better to move on and spend your time elsewhere. But it's a luxury that we've had built in, luckily, in terms of our budgets.
This lady all in white on the front row.
You talk about the importance of your relationships with your subjects. So I think particularly with S-Town, John was constantly calling you, and you seem to have quite a big relationship with him, at least definitely for him. How do you stop yourself getting personally involved or offering up advice when you're meant to be observing?
I'm not afraid of offering advice. Well, it depends on the type of advice. Not with John, but for instance, like, another person in the podcast, Rita, John's cousin, was going through this legal battle with a friend of John's, Tyler. And often on either side, they would call and kind of ask for my legal thoughts that were kind of verging on legal thoughts, or what I thought they should do. And that stuff, I'm not going to do, because first of all, I don't even know what to say, and if I did, it wouldn't be appropriate. But in terms of what I think about a thing, I think that's what makes the conversation real. If John's saying, I think this, and this, I'm okay saying, I don't think that's that bad. To see what he says. You need to kind of have that push and pull, and in an honest way. You need to be yourself. So I think it's good to get, I don't know if that's personal though. To me, that is interviewing. That is what interviewing is. Yeah, and then if, there are plenty of things that might come up where you don't feel comfortable, and you kind of just either say so, or say I don't know, or deflect, and ask a question instead. Ask a question back. Well, what do you think about that?
And Richard, that's relevant for you as well. What's your take on that?
On the relationships with characters,
Yeah.
I cared about everybody a lot, and so I definitely was listening with a lot of emotion to them. And for me, I wasn't speaking back very much. It's kind of you just kind of maintain eye contact and listen carefully. But yeah, I don't know. It's an emotional toll for sure.
Yeah, and so it should be, really. 2 more questions I think we've got time for. This lady here. Just at the back there.
Thank you. Hi. I listened to S-Town and really loved it. I haven't seen your film, unfortunately, but I wanted to ask about the relationship with the people in your film and in S-Town, and the relationship with their mental health, and where, as a maker, someone that gets very close to them, where do you draw the line? How do you navigate the difficult questions of what you can and cannot say? And what is your responsibility as you accompany them through the story and maybe affect their choices and their journey? And how you navigate that as makers with regards to their mental health?
I just try to be a human that I want to be, basically. I don't know. I try to. There's no easy answer, and you're figuring it out. And there are situations I was in S-Town that I've never been in, and probably will never be in again. Having a subject talk about wanting to kill himself. I didn't want him to, and so I said, "Please don't." I don't know. It's not a science. It's trying to just be follow your own moral compass, I guess, in the situations. and then it could be very specific to each specific situation, I guess. And I'm sure like I didn't make all the right choices, and I have my own regrets and feelings about different choices I made in different situations, for sure.
Richard, the film never judged, but people in the film labelled Kathy as a hoarder, and Gary at one point where he's despondent with her says she's mentally ill for sure. I mean, how did you approach that?
Kathy was never diagnosed with a mental illness, and so I definitely, when somebody would label her, I would just try to listen and look past that. So in a similar way that you just try to be human with people. So, I didn't feel like it was my position or the film's position to label her, but it was important to give people room to say the things that they thought, but then kind of let the film subvert that, or show evidence in other ways.
Yeah. One very last quick question then. This gentleman here with the beard.
Hi guys.
Hi.
I feel like it's a very exciting time for both documentary and podcast, and lots of different kind of genres mixing. And I've always kind of wondered about the mixture of the kind of the podcast narrative or the This American Life kind of toolkit, and the documentary one. I'd just be curious to hear you guys maybe talk a little bit about maybe what you learned from a documentary, like you talked about how kind of being excited about catching these moments, and vice versa, like from kind of the how we're kind of the podcast revolution is changing storytelling, like how that maybe informed your.
What we learned from like the different crafts, basically the different medium. It's interesting. I mean, this has been my first like experience kind of digging into a film. And there are just little things you notice that are just different. Like the quotes that you go to in a film, like they can be different. They don't have to be as like strong. Actually, I've noticed even just watching films, like it's like you can get away with different things because someone's holding back saying something, and you can hear and you can see that, and that plays differently.
You see the subtext, or
you see Whereas like. There are quotes that I would never use on the radio that you can use in film. That's like one thing I've learned that's been remarkable. I don't know. You had lots of kind of little things like that, or thinking about what the equivalent of the preparing an interview and thinking about whether to what role the interviewer is going to play in the interview or not.
Yeah, and I think also from listening to S-Town, there is a very much a subjectivity to that mode, where we're listening to the story through Brian's experience of it, and I think documentary is always subjective, and so I think that was a big learning process of the course of making this, was that like the things I was interested in looking at, where I turn the camera, that there's like a presence felt in the subjectivity of the person who formed these relationships, but it's not necessarily spoken outright. It's kind of just there because if you're watching it, then there was a person with a camera there. So, right, yeah, you can feel me follow his directions to walk to the back of the office, and you can kind of sense that I'm a little confused about where to turn, and but that's just inherent in the footage. So.
It's been interesting to not have writing to like go to. As an editor of radio stories, it's often you need to have better topic sentence here. We need to signpost this better at this point. We need to sharpen this idea, and that's all work you're doing in the writing. None of which we had at our disposal with For the Birds, and that was definitely I'd had to like when I was giving these guys notes, just to be like, oh, that's not a note I can give, like topic sentence. I can't. That doesn't exist in that way. It does exist in other ways, and that was just interesting. I mean, it's still very new to me, but it was cool to think in a different way about what the ways that you accomplish that you use the medium to accomplish the same things you're trying to accomplish with those tools in writing.
That was a brilliant question, to bring the two forms and the differences together at the end, because that's what we're aiming to do, is the connectivity and the relevance between the two. if you haven't seen For the Birds, please go. It's on tomorrow at 12:15 in the showroom. I can't remember which showroom, but easy to find out.
I think Cinema One.
Cinema One, we think. But please go. It's a wonderful film. It's really human. It's raw and it's sad at times, but it's also heartwarming and empowering, I think. All that remains then is to thank Richard and Brian for their time and insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.